Hello, this is Noaya Gindi, the Executive Director of Al-Qazaz Foundation for Education and Development, QED, and I'm happy to be facilitating this webinar about with the Together project and co-director Andrew Lusztyk. This is part of QED's monthly webinars. And I'll give you a brief intro about QED. QED builds, connects, and empowers individuals and communities to foster equity of access and outcome. This is done through innovative education and development projects rooted in the values of human rights, democracy, and social justice. So QED, based on its experience in education and technology, tries to bridge the gap between the service providers and the disadvantaged communities. And we have done that through a number of projects so far, such as the Women Wellness Program and the Catch-Up Program, which is an educational program for students who have a gap in their education, such as refugees or newcomers who have a problem with their English language or missed years in their education. And the Family Law Project and the English training program. We also try to be the community partner to academic institutions, so providing a community connection for the academic institution to the research community. This is more or less what we do. And we have partnered actually in a number of research projects with York University and created a platform for Ottawa University. Go back to this specific webinar. So today's webinar is about the Welcome Group program and specifically about how effective social connections can accelerate refugee integration. Our webinar, as I said, is presented by Andrew Lusztyk. He's the co-director of the Together project. Andrew leads the development and management of the Together project's flagship Welcome Group program, which connects groups of volunteers with refugee households to promote inclusion and better integrated communities. To date, the program has been implemented in 5 cities across the province of Ontario, and connected over 400 refugee newcomer and 450 volunteers. Andrew's experience lies in designing, implementing, and evaluating programs that engage and activate communities to drive purposeful social impact, and has included projects across Europe, Africa, and North America. And Andrew now is based in Toronto. So I just want to remind you something. So you have a Q&A button in the left side of your screen. So please use it to add any of the questions that you want to ask through our presentation. I'll leave the presentation to Andrew to start.
Great. So hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. Thank you to QED and to Dr. Al-Gindi for hosting me for this webinar. It's always kind of fun to have an opportunity to share a little bit about what we've been learning. And so to keep things quite short, I'll just kind of give you a bit of a agenda for what we're going to be talking about today. So in the context of the Welcome Group program, what we want to do is just talk about how it started, so the kind of context for the program, what we learned while doing it, and also what it could mean and what the next steps would be for us as Together project, but also potentially for you who's listening, and some of our partners, and kind of what kind of community involvement in refugee integration might actually mean. So just in a bit of background, again, I'm Andrew, I'm one of the co-directors of Together Project. It's a project of Tides Canada, and I'll jump right into the history of kind of where we started from. So Together Project was initially a kind of responsive citizens initiative in 2016 in response to the Syrian refugee crisis. What we really wanted to do was match refugee households with volunteer, what we call welcome groups for integration support. And the idea here was that we wanted to give community members as volunteers an active role in the integration process, initially settlement process, but later integration process, rather than just being kind of a passive observer to the integration system. We wanted to give volunteers the tools and the access to actually play an active role, to kind of tap this previously untapped or fully untapped potential within the community itself to get involved in that process. Furthermore, we also wanted to build something that would be proactive as opposed to reactive. So as opposed to something that is kind of in response to kind of a very acute emergency, something that actually is kind of built into the community and that can further it along in a more sustainable and evolutionary way, so that we can constantly be learning as we're doing this. So in a nutshell, I think most of you who are listening probably already know the nuts and bolts of what we do, but the Welcome Group program is based on the Group of Five model of private sponsorship. So a group of volunteers will be matched with a discrete newcomer household. So it could be a couple, it could be an individual. In our experience, typically it's been a family. We wanted to include some key features in the program that wanted to kind of, we would really augment the role that volunteers would take place. I mean, community volunteer mentorship is nothing new necessarily, but we wanted to really build out the program into one that would be best set up for success as possible, taking the learnings from different experiences that we've had from other programs, similar programs that existed. So in a nutshell, a couple of the key features were training. So we wanted to make sure our volunteers understood as much as they could about how refugee resettlement worked, and also, what the key elements of settlement and integration actually looked like. We did group matching, so in order to kind of balance out availability and capacity and to avoid burnout in our volunteers, we did matching by groups. We also provided translation and interpretation support, so a separate category of volunteer, we call them cultural ambassadors, would provide that kind of linguistic bridge to help with initial communication between newcomers and their volunteers. Evaluation and iterative learning. So the idea here is that from the get-go, we wanted to learn about what was working and what wasn't. And that's really kind of the genesis of where this presentation is coming from, these learnings. And every time we did it, we can learn a little bit more, learn a little bit more. So it wasn't set in stone from the start. It's very much a learning initiative. We also focused on vulnerability. So this is something perhaps we can get into later, but one characteristic of the community that we were initially working with, government-assisted refugees, is they're especially vulnerable, especially compared to, for example, privately sponsored refugees. And so there's a lot of limitations in terms of social connectivity that I'll get into a little bit later, but we really want to make sure that no one is falling through the cracks in terms of access to social connections. We also use a preference matching system, so we tried to learn as much as we could about the newcomers that we were working with, as well as the volunteers, and we tried to find the most compatible fit we could. We knew it wasn't going to be perfect, but at least if there's some kind of commonalities, we'd assume the match would be more successful. And also we worked in close collaboration with different resettlement assistance program service provider organization, or RAP SPOs. So these are actors in the settlement sector around Ontario. For example, in Toronto, we've worked closely with our partner Costi Immigration Services, and not only did we kind of co-develop a lot of the features of this program with our partners, but also they were actually built into the way the program actually was delivered. So volunteers would have a key link to the kind of institutions of settlement, in addition to their own linkages to the community more broadly. So in terms of expectations, what we thought we were going to be doing was that we provide volunteers the opportunity to form friendships with the refugee newcomers that we're connecting them with. We figured that refugees could use these volunteer social networks. So obviously the lack of social networks is one of the kind of characteristics of refugees when they're resettled. We thought that they can kind of tap in for employment and social purposes to the networks of our volunteers. And we also imagined that matches would progress along a general 1-year timeline of settlement. So kind of, from arrival to month 13, where families might be transitioning to social assistance. That's kind of the general timeline that most newcomer households will be following, and that's generally where the volunteers would kind of find their access to support. And so, an example on the right here is one of our training manuals that we developed as part of our kind of initial push. As you can see, it says months 1 and 2. So the idea here is really that, as volunteers are progressing through the match, they're following different areas of training around settlements and later around integration. And that was kind of the expectation that we had set up for the match itself. So how did it go? I mean, over the course of about a year, we made roughly 100 matches in 5 different cities across Ontario. So it was there's a lot of work being done. We heard from a lot of different experiences, very different profiles of volunteers, of newcomers. Time being limited, I don't want to get too much into to those details, although I'm happy to talk about it in the questions. In a nutshell, there was a lot of learning. There's a lot of expectations that we had that weren't met, both in a negative and a positive sense, and also just there's the learning curve around what we wanted to do and what we realized was actually quite challenging to do was quite large. In a nutshell, we had a very high satisfaction rate from the people who participated in our program. Both volunteers and refugees reported being very satisfied with the experience. The negative experiences were thankfully very rare, and that's certainly something that we wanted to, above all, mitigate. But we really kind of wanted to learn not just whether or not the experience was satisfactory, but if it was actually effective, if it was actually useful, and if not, how can we make it so? So some of the themes that were coming out from the feedback that we're getting from our matches, and just to quickly make a note on that, throughout the course of these matches, we'd also do check-ins, we'd do surveys, feedback surveys, focus groups, both with newcomers and with volunteers, to kind of check in as much as we could to learn about what was working and what wasn't. Sometimes this was easier to glean than other times, but these themes would kind of emerge from matches that we thought were working and ones that were struggling a little bit more. So in terms of what we saw from challenging matches, there was actually sometimes a difficulty in forming that social connection or friendship. Language was obviously a big part of this. The profile of the newcomers that we were working with was that typically they arrived with lower language levels, and obviously language, being able to kind of communicate comfortably, excuse me, is one of the kind of key tenets of being able to form a connection. So there's certainly the language piece, but also just in terms of status perception. So people coming from different backgrounds, not necessarily having the same kind of life experience as some of our volunteers. And also just that, we kind of assume that if we put well-meaning people in a room with people who obviously need support, some kind of social connection would kind of organically form quite quickly, and that could kind of progress along the timeline that we had expected. So in some of these cases, it actually wasn't what was happening. Another area of challenge was around lack of clarity around objectives and effectiveness. And this is rather what we were hearing mostly from volunteers. At first, our concern was about how much support or how little support they felt they had or needed. What they're actually often reporting as one of the challenges was just uncertainty of what's actually an effective use of their time. For example, the match might be quite strongly on the social side, and they felt as though we're not actually addressing any of the key problems. We're sitting around having tea, we're socializing a lot. I don't feel like I'm making an actual difference. Or just more generally, I'm not really sure what the issues are, and it's uncomfortable for us to kind of get that explicitly from the newcomers that we're working with. Also, what we were finding is that social networks themselves were actually of limited utility to a lot of the GARs that we were working with. And a lot of that, again, has to do with the kind of profile of the newcomer that we were working with. The assumption was that if I have a friend who owns a plumbing business and you're a plumber, I can connect you to that individual and you can kind of get a fast track to a meaningful employment. What we're actually finding is that there's a lot of barriers that would happen before those kind of social networks would actually be useful. Language being one, obviously more imminent and urgent settlement or integration challenges. So it's almost as though the newcomer participants are at a stage that was a little bit too early to really capitalize on those social networks. What we saw that was working in terms of themes from the matches that were quite strong were these clearly defined priorities. So they're often urgent. There's action that needed to take place quite imminently. And so really there was kind of a launch pad for the match. From the moment they sat down, there was an imminent healthcare need. They really needed to access a specialist. They weren't sure how to do so. Their children wasn't in school yet. They really wanted to make sure that they're plugged into the education network. There's something that they needed to have done immediately, and they needed help doing so. And that's really where these matches kind of took off, because there wasn't even time to necessarily form that kind of social connection because there was work to be done. And that kind of propelled the match forward in a meaningful way. We also saw dynamic, independent, and goal-oriented volunteers. These are volunteers who, in the world of volunteer management, they're called the achievers, ones who really needed to kind of set goals and really kind of prioritize what needed to be done. And they kind of took it upon themselves to look into these different challenges and how they can actually kind of structure their matches around them. Other kinds of volunteers might want to focus more so on the social component, but without that initial push, they didn't actually have anything to kind of latch onto. So that was a really interesting learning for us. And also, finally, just mutual buy-in. So both the volunteers were kind of committed to this kind of flexible idea of the match, being kind of come what may, we're going to try to make this work. And also the newcomers themselves, they understood that this was support, and it was a two-way street. They needed to kind of provide a platform for how this match might work, rather than kind of passively leave the role to the volunteers. So this led us to kind of broader learnings. We can't expect or enforce friendships, and also friendship carries different meaning for different people. Laying out the nature of the match as one about establishing friendships can carry different connotations for different people, and that's not something that we wanted to really push. And we realized that if we start the relationship on the notion that you're now friends, people can be disappointed for different reasons, right? In the sense that either I thought friendship was this, I thought friendship was this, and what it actually turned out to be is that the volunteers want to help me with they want to tutor me in English, or they want to kind of look through paperwork. I thought it was going to be something else, and same thing for the volunteers. I thought it was going to be much more casual, but it turns out that there's actually kind of very strong issues that I don't necessarily feel prepared for, and my expectations were different. And again, another learning was that the participants in our programs weren't really ready for the kind of social network piece to be heavily emphasized. And finally, that the timelines that we were seeing were very different, and it was hard to kind of generalize what an average match would look like based on the timelines that we were proposing. As I'm sure a lot of you already know, settlement it fluctuates in terms of kind of what kind of profile of newcomers are arriving, what their needs are, the geography, where they're being resettled, what they have access to. And so it's very hard to kind of create this very typical idea of what a match is going to look like, because, invariably the people who are involved are so incredibly different. So this led us to a number of pivots. I'm going to go over three. There's a lot to go over, but I just want to highlight three that we kind of, that led to direct adjustments in our kind of programming. One was quite important, was the focus on newcomer defined priorities. So moving the basis of the relationship, the match, away from friendship and just kind of social connection, a friend in your living room, to your top priorities. What do the newcomers involved have as their top barriers, top priorities that they actually want to go through and need specific help with? And so this is part of the surveying process that we use. We try to kind of glean as much information around that, getting the buy-in from the newcomers around this is what you're actually going to be focusing on. And what emerged was what you see on the right here. Typical areas of focus included language acquisition, which is a conversation in and of itself. Navigating services, usually around healthcare, pathways toward meaningful employment. So again, not necessarily finding a job within immediately, but actually understanding what it takes to get to kind of meaningful, gainful employment. And also a focus on youth, so tutoring, making sure they're doing well in school, have access to extracurricular activities, and that they're socializing. The second pivot was around the friendship and social connection piece. So again, we wanted to de-emphasize the idea of friendship. Of course, it happens, and hopefully it happens organically. But what we really wanted to establish more so is that based on that previous pivot point, these priorities, the social connection is actually built on the reliability and trust and cooperation, working towards a mutual goal that those priorities allow. And so that's actually where, over time that can kind of happen organically by working together basically on a common project. So again, the changes to the program here were a change in our language to better manage the expectations both of volunteers and newcomers. The emphasis on the kind of a practical, regular support to kickstart the relationship. So now when we're doing the introductions, we don't talk about just, let's get to know each other, but more so, let's go through these priorities. Let's set up your next couple of meetings. Who's going to be doing what? Really kind of building a structure into the workflow, essentially, of the volunteers, and letting kind of the relationship build out of that. And in that way, what we're doing is, allowing that focus to be really on those priorities and letting it happen organically. And also de-emphasizing the social network. So not making that the kind of the focal point of the relationship. But of course, if it happens, then all the better, but we let it happen organically. Finally, keeping the program flexible and focused. So this is where we try to, based on that idea of the different pathways that newcomers can take in their first year of settlement or first several years of settlement, we wanted to aim for the highest and best use of volunteer time and effort. So this is more of a kind of a logistical programmatic shift rather than what volunteers were doing. But what we did was we shortened the formal length of the match. So we actually formalized it at the 6 month mark. The main reason for this is that we typically found that was a good amount of time to allow for a relationship to build on those priorities. So if at the 6 month mark, having worked through those priorities, or at least worked to address them, that social relationship was there, fantastic. Together Project can kind of remove itself from the equation. So the actual social relationship is allowed to grow at its own pace. And if not, there's still plenty of time for you to be rematched with another family and kind of address those practical supports. The idea here being that in the matches, kind of aiming to maximize the best matches and minimize the worst matches, what we wanted to do is assume that at least if a social connection was hard to form, at least volunteers can make a practical contribution to kind of practical integration outcomes, as opposed to the idea that every match will kind of take place over a long term of building a social relationship, and hopefully along the way these priorities will be addressed. In that sense, this shift was the focus was shifted from settlement to integration. So rather than kind of address challenges that in the immediate sense, we wanted to kind of focus on the longer term idea of integration, kind of setting up these relationships to look at the bigger questions of integration rather than just the settlement challenges that could be addressed by existing institutions, by existing networks, and really capitalizing on where volunteers can play that role. So when the client of a settlement agency leaves that office, what can the community do to kind of continue the support that they're receiving? And finally, we shifted to cohorts. So rather than doing kind of rolling matches, rolling program delivery, we shifted to the cohort system where groups of matches would take place. And that allows for iteration. So every time we do one of these cohorts, we can make adjustments, we can fine tune, and we can kind of learn about what's working with little interventions as we go along. And so I'll pause there and just say that since we've implemented these pivots about a year ago now, we've seen volunteers reporting a greater clarity of their role. We've seen fewer matches ending due to miscommunication. So there's an idea now that we know what we're here for and we know what we're trying to do. And also from newcomers, we understand that they volunteers are there for as well. So there's a kind of a greater clarity of the relationship and kind of higher success in terms of the relationship that we're aiming to build. There's still plenty of work, and again, we don't have time to get into it, but there's other challenges that kind of continue and are continuing to kind of try to work through. Location being one, kind of the tools and trainings that volunteers can use is another. But certainly, we've seen an improvement in both the experience and also the results of our program. So to kind of go into the last section, what does this mean? What we wanted to do is kind of ground what we're seeing in, the theoretical frameworks that already exist around integration and also just kind of social theory. And in this sense, we kind of wanted to be able to learn even more about what it is that we're doing and how we can do so more effectively, and how it's actually both informed, how it can also inform actual research, but also be informed by our participation in that kind of research. So one area that has been of great interest to us is contact theory. And contact theory, this is by no means my area of expertise, but certainly it's increasingly one that we're looking into. Contact theory in a nutshell is looking at kind of how group contact, intergroup contact can reduce prejudice. And so in the kind of immediate obvious sense, what we're seeing is some of the conditions of our matches kind of align with the idea that that you see on the left here. Intergroup cooperation towards common goals is a way that prejudice can be reduced between majority and minority groups. So these are two groups that are cooperating towards a shared goal, and that typically can kind of reduce the prejudice, and actually it's a good basis for kind of intergroup friendship and understanding. Beyond that, the extended contact effect is something that's been very interesting to us as well. And again, this is something I didn't have too much time to get into, but the role that the program has in fomenting kind of positive discourse through our volunteers is also something that's come up that's been very interesting. Volunteers report to us that they've learned so much about the refugee experience. This is something that they can share within their own networks, their own communities, in their daily lives. And this is fantastic for us and super interesting from a research perspective, just because volunteers that are working with us are already kind of on board. They understand, we've already, kind of mobilized them in a way that we couldn't with potentially people that are in their social networks. So based on their experience and the idea of extended contact, the extended contact effect is that if somebody, for example, a volunteer in a program has a positive experience working with refugees, somebody in that volunteer social network, by extended contact to that refugee through that volunteer, can have a greater sense of familiarity and potentially positive sentiment towards the newcomers themselves. And so that's one thing that we want to explore more fully, because it's an unintended consequence really of the program that we're running. The other piece is social capital. So social capital has a lot of different conceptualizations and definitions. What we typically refer to as social capital in this context is the one you see on the right. This is something that has been kind of developed since the late 90s. The bridges, bonds, and links idea of social capital. Bridges being between groups, which is obviously of interest to us. Bonds within groups, and links between groups and institutions. And so in this sense, we see the Welcome Group program kind of emerging as this social bridge in the concept of social capital. And that bridge, if I can extend that metaphor, shared goals. So it's a two-way street of integration. It's the fact that it's not volunteers who are unilaterally kind of working to integrate a newcomer to the host community, and it's also not the newcomers who are unilaterally assimilating within that culture, but it's really a bridge. It's providing that bridge that both sides can work towards, and that's something that's also hugely interesting to us, especially also because I didn't have space on a slide, but fostering social capital is also one of the 17 characteristics of what's called the welcoming community, and that's work that's been pioneered by Professor Victoria Esses at Western University, among others. And this is the kind of the characteristics of the welcoming community that we want to kind of foster to ensure that economic and social integration kind of can exist, or rather can be fostered more effectively. And so that's why that's kind of another way that we can see our program fitting into this kind of more holistic view of what integration can look like. So to conclude, I'm not sure actually how my time is doing, but just to conclude in terms of our next steps, so we kind of take all of this learning and we take it in two directions, research and development, really. So on the research front, what we're now doing is we're working out through the effectiveness, the effectiveness of our program on developing refugee social capital. So what does that actually mean in terms of, what does our program actually mean in terms of the extent to which it improves refugee social capital, how it does so most effectively? That's something that we want to now take with kind of an academic lens to, and we're hoping to start that in the fall. And the other research project that we want to investigate is that piece around welcoming communities and how kind of volunteer engagement itself can kind of, within volunteer social networks, how that can actually work to build more welcoming communities. So that's also kind of a research track that we're focusing on. And in terms of program development, this is where we want to focus on kind of more specialized training and resources. So now that we know, kind of how to mobilize volunteers in a way that gives them clarity, that gives them purpose, and also is responsive to the needs of newcomers themselves, how can we best equip them with resources, with training, with learning, and support to tackle those integration barriers? And so the way we're starting this, because it cuts across so many different other categories, is through language. So right now we're working through developing specialized support for volunteers who are going to be focusing on language acquisition, supporting language acquisition in their matches. So to wrap up, I think that there's a number of learnings that in our experience that can have obviously positive use for the settlement sector more broadly. Certainly it has for our own project. We also, if there's an interest in the work that we're doing now, in addition to kind of our core programming, we're very open to kind of, working with people in the field. We're all ears. So if you want to reach out, please do so. And also, obviously, this is an opportunity for questions and conversation. I'm happy to kind of elaborate on anything that I had to gloss over. If there's something that I didn't touch on that maybe I can answer, I'd be happy to do so. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Andrew. It was a very inspirational presentation. It's really good to get to know more about the Together project and its development and learning lessons. And I think now we can open the Q&A session, and I think we have a number of questions here. So the first question is how important language is to integrate, and why we are beginning our program development focus on it, and how volunteers can be involved in that process. So basically, language. I think you can share your screen so that they can see you when answering those questions.
Oh yeah, sure. How do I do that?
I will stop sharing.
Okay. Oh, I've lost the ability to share my screen, but I'm not sure. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So language, in a nutshell, language kind of cuts across all the different integration goals that we're looking at, whether it's dealing with trauma, whether it's developing a sense of belonging, developing confidence. It's the kind of the first thing that's reported from the vast majority of newcomers that we work with. Everyone seemingly has a similar story to, I've tried to use English and I ended up feeling like I offended somebody or I made a mistake and now I'm just too shy to use it with anybody else. A lot of volunteers, a lot of newcomers report not having a kind of a safe space to even try to learn the language, and that, in a sense, kind of inhibits their ability to grasp it, and also inhibits, therefore, their ability to use that language to achieve higher levels of integration. So, one of the characteristics, specifically with government-assisted refugees, that we've been seeing is that they arrive with really low language levels, and this is one of the distinguishing elements between them and privately sponsored refugees. Certainly in the Syrian cohort, where to even gain meaningful employment, for example, you typically need a Canadian language benchmark 4 or 5, maybe even higher, to join a bridging program, a recertification program, a job training program. If you're arriving with level 0, it's going to take you quite a bit of time to get from 0 to 4 or 5 just by attending ESL and LINK classes, not to mention having to deal with all the other barriers that are taking place. If you're a GAR, you're arriving with a lot of other vulnerabilities, whether it's health issues, a large family, making sure that everyone's in school, everyone's doing well in school, not to mention just the kind of stress of resettlement migration itself. So to that end, we've recognized it as kind of a key component of integration, and virtually all the other aspects, all the other areas of focus that I mentioned, all relate to language in some way. Obviously, finding work is a natural one, accessing services, being able to kind of pick up the phone and schedule an appointment, or move an appointment, or sign your kids up for something, and even with youth, I mean, for a lot of parents, they struggle with the inability to communicate with their teachers. They want to know how their kids are doing at school. They have no idea, and it's a great challenge for them to do so. So that's one of the reasons why language is kind of one of the priorities for us. And volunteers, even if they have no ESL training experience, they at a minimum can speak English, and they have time. And so what we want to do is give them the opportunity to kind of sit in with newcomers and practice conversations, work through their ESL or LINK worksheets, address kind of job-specific vocabulary. So, for example, learning vocabulary that's relevant to accessing a certain job or field of work in general, recertification programs, etc. And so what we want to do is give volunteers as much kind of confidence and also resources to make that acquisition practice as effective as possible. So, what's an actual effective use of your time in helping somebody learn the language outside of the classroom? And again, the idea here is we want to complement existing services. Obviously, ESL and LINK classes exist, and they exist for a reason, and they're constantly learning, and they can be very effective. But again, it's that outside of the classroom support, community support. What happens when the newcomer is not directly learning from an instructor, but back in their community? How can volunteers be involved in that process? And so that's our initial area of focus. So as we speak, we're working with practitioners, we're kind of working with our volunteers to kind of learn, and obviously the newcomers to learn what's working, what isn't, and how can we best equip our volunteers to work through that process.
Shall I? Okay, so the other question by Michelle Ball. What was the reaction from your SPO partners to this program? How did you work to create their buy-in, and how did they use their internal resources to enable this program to work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we luckily from the very start, in terms of kind of our formal conceptualization as Together project, we've worked very closely with our RAP SPO partners. One of the reasons I think we had buy-in was that obviously when we were starting, there was a lot of there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of work to be done, frankly, and I think that we, as much as we could, we wanted to kind of develop a good relationship with these people, these organizations, because the people within them have a huge wealth of experience. They're doing fantastic work, and what we wanted to really develop was how can we support them. And so I think that in terms of the buy-in question, really what we were trying to do is figure out what actually helps. Oh, sorry, is it working or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Just checking on sharing.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, and so the buy-in that we got, I think, was really due to the kind of co-creation and collaboration process from the start. We took this program, we worked with our partners to kind of figure out what works, what doesn't, from their perspective as well. What's the kind of rapport we want to establish? Again, how can we help rather than hinder the work that they're already doing? And so this goes right into the kind of training that we give our volunteers, the relationship that we establish between our volunteers and our partners in terms of lines of communication, lines of support, and certainly even the relationship that I have with our partners. So identifying clients, surveying those clients, making sure that we're responsive to the needs of the sector and our partners, in a way that we can allocate those resources to them. And I think, generally speaking, when we initially had run this program as well, we'd also included surveys with the caseworkers, so the settlement workers who were involved on the partner side. And we had very positive feedback in terms of how effective the program was from their point of view. The people who were working with the clients that we were connecting with, had very positive things to report around the utility of the volunteers involved. And we've been very lucky to kind of maintain these positive relationships with their partners, and they've done a great job in kind of helping us learn constantly about what we're doing. I mean, even with what I just mentioned, the kind of learning about language training, etc., that's kind of an ongoing process that our partner Costi is involved in. I mean, there's practitioners and experts in this field that we can tap into. And the key thing is that we don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel, because these are people who have had decades of experience of work. And what we want to do is to kind of map that understanding and that experience into a volunteer, a volunteer opportunity that can complement that experience. So yeah, I guess that's how I'd answer that question. It's a complicated one, because we're certainly, the role we want to fit into is really the kind of social connections piece. We don't the settlement sector exists, and it's effective, and we just kind of want to figure out how we can involve the community in that process as well. And so we're very lucky to have partners who are very patient and helpful with us in that process.
Yeah, it's a pretty complicated question, I believe. And I think this one is complicated too. So this one is also from Michelle, and she's asking about the metrics used to measure successful integration and settlement.
Yeah, sorry, let me get this back here. Yeah, so it's a good question. So initially, I'll answer that question very quickly. One is that we're constantly trying to learn what the correct metrics are or should be. In terms of kind of what's reasonable in terms of an expectation for our volunteers and also for the newcomers. 6 months in the grand scheme of things isn't a long time. So, thinking about kind of what kind of outcomes we actually want to be measuring is quite tricky. Like I said, when we initially started our kind of surveying process, our evaluation process, it was a very simple kind of satisfaction survey. So we're just trying to understand, is this connection, are you enjoying this experience? Is this connection even useful to you? When we hear back yes, the next question obviously is, well, how is this useful to you? And so this is kind of where we're at now, where we're trying to incorporate, reasonable metrics into the work that we're doing in terms of kind of tracking the progress that our matches are making. So if we're focusing on these kind of metrics of different areas of focus, so whether it's language or health or whatever else it might be, that's the kind of metric that we want to use to track outcomes of our matches. So have newcomers reported feeling as though they've made progress along these different priorities? To what extent not? Same thing with volunteers. What we want to start tracking, going back to the idea of kind of welcoming communities and your own social networks, is to what extent has this changed your perception of refugee resettlement, or perception, or to what extent is this, have you communicated this within your own social networks? We want to kind of capture all of that stuff that's happening in a way that's actually kind of effective and also grounded in something that already exists. So again, that social capital evaluation framework that we're developing as we speak, that's building off of the Toronto Vital Signs report that came out last year, to kind of capture social, the level of social capital amongst different Torontonians. That could potentially be a metric for our work as well. Kind of to what degree do newcomers feel a greater sense of belonging, and capturing kind of that change in social capital through our programming. So now we're at that stage where, anecdotally and qualitatively, we have this kind of information that, people are satisfied, the program, works. Newcomers report that it's helpful, and now we want to kind of be a little bit more specific and tie it to existing frameworks as much as we can to kind of keep developing that process. And it's a great question, and it's something that we're kind of constantly thinking about in the context of the program that we're actually delivering.
Okay, great. And the fourth question would be, what helped establish trust between the volunteers and the refugee newcomers?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, this is something that I wish I knew, again, kind of how to capture what that turning point often was. So what's been interesting to us is just what kind of social connection and what friendship means and what trust means between different groups. So going back to the idea of volunteers reporting that they're just spending a lot of time socializing and they don't even feel like that's potentially necessarily effective. Conversely, when we're surveying newcomers, they report that that's kind of the most use. Oftentimes, that's kind of one of the very useful parts of the match is just the fact that they have someone that they can call upon, that they have kind of someone they feel like a local advocate. And so, you know, where that happens is that, like I said, when they have a shared goal, when volunteers kind of commit to supporting a specific task or a specific priority and then follow through on that, the follow through and the reliability is so hugely important. And I think that this is where we've learned so much in terms of setting expectations for our volunteers around, you know, don't commit to something that you can't actually follow through on. It's important for both the newcomers and volunteers to kind of work on things that that they actually have the time for, because we don't want to burn volunteers out. We don't want newcomers to feel as though they're promised the kind of support that they're not receiving. And so usually, like I said, like that usually happens through a number of kind of repeat instances of support. Usually now, for example, in terms of just as a trust building exercise, when we make a match, we try to set up immediately kind of regular visits around a key priority area. So for example, typically it's around language practice. So just, you know, come by every Sunday or Saturday and spend some time, get to know one another, and kind of, you know, show the household that you're matched with that you're generally there to support and that you're going to follow through and that you're committed to kind of helping them make progress towards one of these priorities of theirs. And I think that, again, if you manage those expectations for the newcomers and explain that, you know, these volunteers are not a panacea, they can't necessarily solve every one of these problems, but they can certainly try to help. I think establishing that tone has been really important, kind of from the outset to I guess, providing an environment where trust can build, rather than kind of assuming that because these volunteers have good intentions and because these newcomers have needs, that kind of trust is going to develop. And usually what we see is when that trust actually starts forming, then they feel comfortable sharing or kind of really, you know, working towards maybe priorities that they otherwise kind of felt uncomfortable involving volunteers in. And it's kind of this gradual process that evolves as the social connection deepens. And again, this is one of these things that's kind of hard to quantify and capture. It's something that I only really hear about when I'm talking to volunteers or you know, to the newcomers in a match about what's working and what isn't. And it's a wonderful thing. But again, capturing kind of what that actually means is part of the evaluation piece that we're constantly trying to work on.
I think actually the trust is a very important topic to be discussed or to be studied regarding the volunteers. They're working with private sponsors, guards, pre-arrival and after coming. It's I think working with the vulnerable communities, it's a very important topic. We have another question also by Myrna Sabah. What methods do you use to recruit group volunteers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really differs. My favorite way to recruit, and I think the way we get the best kind of volunteers is through word of mouth. I think that, again, a lot of the volunteers that come into our program, at least initially, have perhaps never met a refugee. They don't know anything about this sector, but they want to learn. And the ones, like I specified, the kind of achievers, to use the terminology, they typically also know other achievers. And I think that the ones that kind of shine in our program, who find that this program resonates with them, they'll find others, whether with my encouragement or not, they'll find others who potentially can also be effective volunteers. So whether it's their own group or maybe a friend of a friend that they know that might find it interesting, that's the best for me, just because it's it's someone that I already have trust with, someone that I've kind of already seen be effective. And that can kind of emerge organically from our program. Otherwise we've used all kinds of different methods. certainly working with universities and colleges, so people in social work programs, aspiring settlement workers, students who have time. Increasingly, we're also working with small businesses, so people who already have experience working in a team. Obviously, that's what they're going to be doing. So they already have kind of an idea of how to structure their time, how to delegate responsibility within a group. That's all a very effective way of thinking about how they're going to be advocating and supporting the newcomers in their match. So that's kind of a new area that we're trying to push into. Is kind of encouraging people who perhaps want to do kind of community involvement with their retail business, or with the local branch of whatever it might be, a financial institution or a travel company. They want to kind of get involved in the community, and they're not really sure how. And it's usually looking to the kinds of volunteers who want to have a bit more of a frontline role. I mean, I think that especially a lot of corporate partners, they'll do days where they volunteer. They'll do kind of a one-off activity. But I think for a lot of people, especially people who are naturally extroverted, who are more social, but also, again, have that kind of achievement drive within them, they can look to, they're looking for something a little bit more substantive. And certainly that's what our volunteer experience is. It's not a light touch kind of program. It's something that really requires a commitment, that really requires you to be thoughtful, to be patient, but at the same time to be dynamic and engaged. And it's certainly that, and certainly much more so than other kind of volunteer opportunities. And that's one way that we try to kind of build an appreciation for it when we're trying to recruit from pre-existing groups. So I don't have a secret sauce, unfortunately, but we're getting closer, I think, to kind of finding the kind of candidates that we want to be involved in the program.
And I think more or less that's our final questions. How were you able to help manage the expectations of both the volunteers and then newcomer refugees?
Right. So so I mentioned that a little bit earlier. The management piece is that's certainly something that we try to go over in our training with our volunteers, and also when we're introducing ourselves to the newcomers that we're going to be matching. It's just kind of establishing what the role is about, what the role is not about, and making sure that there's a reasonable expectation of how the role that volunteers are going to be playing, and as long as everyone's kind of aligned on that, and everyone understands, that there's limitations to what volunteers can do, I think that's just kind of a really important thing to lay out at the outset of the program to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And so that's certainly something that we hope that volunteers, by the time they're matched, they already have an understanding of what's realistic. If otherwise, I mean, through the course of a match, I'm also involved in, kind of monitoring and checking in. And sometimes it does come up where volunteers say, we really want to help them with this, but we've just kind of exhausted all options. We're not sure what else to do. And so it requires a bit of coaching from me too, to kind of help them to understand, you're doing the best you can. There are limitations, and the best you can do is, potentially refer them to others who might be better equipped, and that's perfectly reasonable. Our volunteers are fantastic, but they're not superheroes, and that's kind of, we have to make sure that they understand that from the outset as well.
Okay, so I just have one last question. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know if, with the transition to welfare with month 13, did this affect the need for more volunteers, or how the dynamics of the volunteer work was done in relation to the sponsors or without the sponsors and all of that?
Yeah, so month 13, it's interesting. When we first started, that was kind of the, much like with the private sponsorship model, the idea was that month 13 was kind of this boogeyman, essentially, that we wanted to make sure that volunteers were well prepared for. And certainly for a lot of families kind of approaching month 13, it was this kind of, scary thing that they felt like they maybe needed some extra support with. because now a lot of our matches are actually past month 13. So by the time volunteers even meet the family, they might already be on OW, or at least, you know, they have a good understanding of what it is. It's certainly, it can be a priority for a match, but typically it just requires a kind of a small shift in language where we have to make sure that the volunteers understand how OW works, and that's part of our training as well. That we provide resources around understanding how different forms of social assistance work, and so understanding how OW works is one piece of that puzzle to kind of give volunteers that understanding, rather than, for example, explaining to them or focusing our explanation to them on how RAP works, for example, the Resettlement Assistance Program. So in some cases, it has been a kind of a very big moment in the match, but generally speaking, again, with the right kind of preparation or with the volunteers, it's not something that's one of the kind of unmet expectations. It's not something that was as predominant in our matches as we thought it would be. Thankfully, because obviously it's a fairly scary experience. So luckily, when it has happened, it's been met head on by the volunteers, and it's been working well.
So I think that's it in terms of the Q&A. I don't know if you want to comment anything else or have anything else to say before I do wrap up.
No, that's it. Just to say. Let me get back on here. That's it for me. What I'll just do is put this back up. But if anyone wants to kind of reach out for further questions or conversation, feel free to reach out to me at my email address. I'm happy to hear from anyone who's listened. But other than that, just thank you so much for facilitating, and thank you to QED for giving me this platform to share some of the work that we're doing.
Actually, I would like to thank you for sharing with us the amazing work that you've done with the Together project and the development of it and the learning process. It's, as you said, it's lots of learning, and it's really important to share such experiences for people working with the settlement agencies and vulnerable communities. I think there are lots of lessons here to be learned, and lots of eye-opening experiences. I enjoyed knowing more about the context theory and the topic of different meaning of friendship, and so we're really happy to know more about the Together project, how it started, origins, and your specific experience. So thanks to everyone who joined us in the webinar, and thanks a lot to the whole Together project group, and thanks a lot to you, Andrew.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.